Judgment is a politically charged game with a lot to say on hot-button political issues of our time, yet despite that, I haven't seen anyone bring up or discuss its politics. I think this is due to how seemingly homogenous the various Yakuza-style games by the Ryuga Gotoku studio are, so few people really paid attention to what the story was saying, let alone wrote anything about it, which is a shame, because what Judgment has to say makes it one of the boldest games in recent memory, so I'm going to give it my best shot. The nature of this video means spoiling the entire story is unavoidable. If you have not played Judgment, I highly recommend doing so because it is a fantastic game, and more importantly, a mystery game, so your enjoyment of the story may be more seriously impacted by spoilers than stories in other genres. With that out of the way, let's talk about the politics of Judgment. The central story in Judgment revolves around private detective Takayuki Yagami's investigation into a series of mysterious murders committed in Kamurocho, a fictional district in Tokyo, by the killer Yagami dubs the Mole. As the story progresses, it becomes evident that the murders are all connected to the Advanced Drug Development Center's research into a potential cure for Alzheimer's called AD9. The killings are all done to cover up failed AD9 human experiments, and most importantly, the killer is Kamurocho PD's golden boy, Detective Mitsuru Kuroiwa. The story in Judgment, then, while certainly about Yagami's dogged pursuit of justice and even redemption, is also about establishment corruption and the ecosystem in which it thrives. Before really delving in, I'd like to address one of the main counter-arguments I foresee being made against what I have to say, specifically the one pointing out Judgment is a game that takes place in Japan, so my experiences as an American are coloring the way I view Judgment and what it says. While this is true, I don't think the American experience with cops is exclusive. There are inherently American issues with U.S. cops, like the way the criminal justice system perpetuates systemic racism through Jim Crow-esque laws, but I think my reading of Judgment is a fair one because the issues present with the police force in Judgment are issues inherent to the role police serve across all societies in a way that transcends nations and borders. What is defined as legal and illegal is completely artificial. Something codified by the law as legal can be grossly immoral, and something condemned by the law as illegal can be moral. The law exists as an assertion of the state's power, and by extension, the police exist as a force of the state to maintain its power, so their violence becomes sanctified. Police violence being justified by the law is utterly meaningless because the people they answer to define the law and force everyone else to accept it, using the police as a violent force. Justifying some violence because it's sanctified under the law and condemning other violence because it isn't is ultimately just arguing semantics. The only real difference between the two types of violence is whether or not the person kicking your teeth in wears a badge. The artificiality between what is defined as legal and illegal is one of Judgment's core themes. In the first 5 minutes of the game, it straight up says, twice, that 99% of all cases in Japan end with a conviction. The system itself is fundamentally corrupt. While Kuroiwa's murders aren't protected by the law, his actions are protected by those in charge of the law, which ultimately makes the distinction trivial because his actions might as well be legal. Yagami's work outside the system specifically promotes the idea that trying to take them down from within would be impossible. While he does expose their wrongdoings in a court of law, he only does so by colluding with the prosecutor, Izumida, because he believes in the same values as Yagami. What both of them do to accomplish the end result of justice is completely illegal, yet it is just in the game's eyes. It's also worth noting that Izumida's boss, the chief prosecutor, is also imprisoned for his role in the AD9 conspiracy. Corruption touches every part of the relevant establishments in Judgment's story, so viewing such deep-rooted corruption through the lens I have isn't just because of my experiences as an American, it's because of issues fundamental to the role of the police as enforcers of the law, which itself is created by those with a vested interest in having the police enforce those laws. Kuroiwa is a killer for hire, employed by the state both for his job as a cop and for his job moonlighting as a murderer, but then again, those jobs aren't two separate entities, rather they're just two sides of the same coin. Judgment makes it clear that Kuroiwa was a corrupt cop long before he was employed as a professional cleaner for politicians' crimes. It's also likely that Kuroiwa learned to be a dirty cop from his former boss, who made backroom deals with the Yakuza before it was reported by a fellow officer. His boss then killed himself, and Kuroiwa murdered the reporting officer in retaliation. For the next 20 years, Kuroiwa used his position as an officer of the law to work jobs for the Yakuza and climb the ranks to a comfortable position as a well-respected detective. Outside of his role as the central antagonist, Kuroiwa also acts as a foil for Yagami. Where Kuroiwa's career in law enforcement was catalyzed by killing, Yagami's career as a defense attorney ended in disgrace when he successfully got an acquittal for a client who was then immediately framed for killing his girlfriend. With his reputation in shambles and his conscience racked with guilt, Yagami left his promising career as an ace attorney behind for a job as a private detective, a profession Judgment presents as generally looked down upon by society, meaning his reputation as the polar opposite of Kuroiwa's. But because both of them are detectives, on paper they should more or less be doing the same things when it comes to cracking open cases and helping out everyday citizens. However, where Yagami actually solves crimes and helps people, Kuroiwa actively tampers with investigations into the deaths of the people he killed. When the two of them finally come to blows, their fighting styles are remarkably similar, with Kuroiwa being the only other character besides Yagami who can use wall attacks. This gives his fighting style similar acrobatic dimensions as Yagami's, and makes the fights against him almost feel like mirror matches. But they aren't quite mirror matches, because Yagami fights Kuroiwa with restraint, despite fighting to avenge a loved one Kuroiwa murdered. Kuroiwa has no such aspirations towards self-control, though, and halfway through the fight, he attempts to gouge out one of Yagami's eyes with an ice pick. To top it all off, he gets flustered and draws a gun on Yagami with the intent to kill, only to be stopped by the chief prosecutor, who talks him down for murdering Yagami solely on the basis that he can't cover it up in their current location. Even though Yagami and Kuroiwa share such strong similarities, they're separated by their intense differences in personal beliefs. This is incredibly important, because while Yagami seeks justice and has been punished over and over for doing so, all Kuroiwa wants is the power to do as he pleases and a fat paycheck, both of which he has in spades. In order to beat Kuroiwa and bring down those he works for, Yagami commits several crimes, such as blackmailing, kidnapping, assaulting an officer of the law, assaulting several officers of the law, and many more illegal acts that would doubtlessly get him imprisoned, and yet Judgment also argues that this is the only way for Yagami to bring Kuroiwa and his higher-ups to justice. The system itself is blatantly corrupt, content to literally kill people as long as the cash keeps flowing, so why shouldn't Yagami work outside of it? The contrast between Yagami and Kuroiwa also helps to better illustrate the game's belief in justice being found outside of the limited definitions set down by the law. It highlights how arbitrary laws are, because Kuroiwa and Yagami both break the law, but the morality behind their actions are far from equal. Where Kuroiwa breaks the law to commit serious harm out of pure self-interest, Yagami breaks it because it's the only way he can keep hunting for the truth on a case that it seems no one wants him to solve. Despite this, society sees Kuroiwa as a paragon of virtue, and Yagami as a degenerate wastrel, purely because Kuroiwa carries a badge. Judgment thus critiques both idolatrous badge worshipping and also the system that permits police to rise above the law, because both falsely equate legality with morality. Another key difference between them is that Yagami has to fend for himself, whereas Kuroiwa has an entire system and very powerful people backing him. All of his heinous crimes are sanctioned by those in power, but despite Yagami's crimes being comparatively minor in offense, he has no power to defend himself. If he gets caught, he's finished. Late in the game, when Yagami finally knows Kuroiwa is the mole, Kuroiwa immediately arrests him to interrogate him back at the police station. During the interrogation, Kuroiwa doesn't even try to hide his corruption, instead deciding to flaunt it at Yagami, taunting him with his power because he knows he's untouchable. Within the very office that claims to protect the law and preserve the peace, Kuroiwa confidently tells Yagami he is in fact a murderer before promising to kill him. All the while, Kuroiwa keeps Yagami in handcuffs just to further exercise his power over him. When another police officer enters the room, Kuroiwa falsifies his interrogation with Yagami to cover up multiple homicides he just committed, and Yagami is powerless to stop him. Judgment's exploration of the power dynamic between cops and civilians is essential, because what ultimately separates cops from civilians is the power cops hold over civilians. Kuroiwa could not carry on the way he does if he was anything other than a cop, and Judgment is keenly aware of it.
ご協力ありがとうございました。
じゃあ私がお送りしましょう。
Outside of Kuroiwa, Judgment's portrayal of the police can be generously described as seething with hatred, with the single most morally righteous cop in the game, Ayabe, still being a dirty cop who sells Yagami restricted information for a quick dime. The only reason Ayabe is the best cop is because the extent of his damage is unknown, so he doesn't win the title of most morally righteous cop by virtue of his actions, but by default because everyone else is so much worse. Every depiction of the police either comes down to them being blatantly corrupt killers or dangerously incompetent. When they aren't breaking it, they doggedly stick to the letter of the law, even when clearly in the wrong. Here again, Judgment highlights a structural breakdown in policing more broadly, the inability to separate legality from morality, and even if detected, the inability to act on that distinction. The police aren't the only ones who break the law, though. If Kuroi was a foil for Yagami, then the Yakuza are a foil for the police. The differences between them aren't quite as severe as the differences between Yagami and Kuroiwa, however, which is the point. The Yakuza in Judgment certainly aren't portrayed as being morally just like Yagami is, but they are more honest than the police. No one in the Yakuza is ever portrayed as having delusions of their work being lawful or benefiting the wider community. Rather, they're an insular group of self-interested thugs with a general commitment to protecting their own, but they never pretend to be more than that. They don't pretend that their violence is justified. In fact, they don't even care if it is or not. This isn't to say they don't have their own internal lies masquerading as core values, such as taking responsibility for one's actions and serving the Yakuza family. Yagami's partner, Kaido, is a former Yakuza member who gets expelled from his family after being set up by the family captain to take the fall for the robbery of their office. That same captain also tries to take a finger from him, which Yagami lawyers Kaido out of doing. The point of this entire scenario is to show how disingenuous the Yakuza's ideals of responsibility and familial commitment really are. Like the police, they care more about appearances than they do the actual values they claim to uphold. Unlike the police, however, they have no delusions of being the moral arbiters of what is just and right. Kaido gets to keep his finger because Matsugane, the head of the family, doesn't want a civilian's bloody pinky. As soon as Kaido's out of the clan, their customs and rules no longer apply to him. The Yakuza and police are both unjust thugs, but the difference is that the Yakuza don't get to enforce their glass house of values onto the general populace. The police do, however, and they get to enforce their values, their laws, through state-sanctioned violence. A new mechanic in Judgment involves running from the police if a street fight goes on too long. Even though Yagami only ever acts in self-defense, the police arriving is not treated as the arrival of safety, but as a punitive punishment for everyone involved regardless of what they did. While the police catching Yagami only results in a fine of 10,000 yen, compared to getting slapped with a game over if the thugs beat him in a fight, he's still being punished for the act of self-defense. The other way to look at this, however, is that Yagami isn't getting fined for self-defense, he's getting fined for not doing it fast enough. In terms of gameplay, this boils down to the police being a punishment for sloppy play, but they are still firmly there as an antagonistic force instead of a safety net like their role as peacekeepers should make them. The police are also arguably worse than thugs because Yagami isn't allowed to fight back. After the cops take their sweet time and finally arrive, Yagami's only option is to run because if he were to defend himself, the consequences would be far worse than getting his teeth smashed in by street thugs. On a mechanical level, cops are definitely more of a threat than the thugs just waiting to stick a knife in Yagami's ribs. This is reinforced further when the story starts coming to a head and Yagami is forced to fight cops, who are by far the most dangerous enemies in the game. Throughout Judgment, there are a few select encounters where Yagami fights one or two Yakuza goons with guns. When Yagami fights the police, on the other hand, there's more than enough armed and dangerous officers of the law to thoroughly murder Yagami. If one of them actually manages to shoot him, each shot gives him a mortal wound, which is a mechanic that caps his maximum health, meaning he can't recover his health past a certain threshold determined by how many mortal wounds he suffered. Outside of the cops and 3 or so Yakuza goons with guns, mortal wounds are a mechanic reserved for especially dangerous boss attacks meant to be avoided at all costs. Whereas 99% of the Yakuza thugs Yagami fights will only give him temporary injuries, the police casually dish out the most lethal attacks Judgment has to offer. The so-called officers of the law do their damnedest to unload enough bullets on an unarmed civilian to make him pass as Swiss cheese. And yes, while an argument could be made that the police using guns on Yagami is mainly a way to escalate the combat's challenge to the peak of its difficulty curve, the fact that the developers saved the police for the end as the most lethal enemy type is very telling of their intentions. The statement here is clear. Police are the enemy. Not just individuals like Kuroiwa, but all of them. The whole system. Honestly, it's incredibly disappointing to me that more people don't talk about Judgment and its themes. I have no doubt that if Judgment was a Western game, it would have gotten a lot of attention from the Western games media for its scathing take on the police. But because it's a Japanese game, and because it comes from the Ryuga Gotoku studio, it just kind of came and went without any further scrutiny over its themes and messaging. I think this relates to a larger problem with the perception of Japanese media in Western circles, especially the weird fetishization of Japan as some nebulous, apolitical, magic anime land where nothing ever means anything so you can consume their media without having to think about it. There's a lot wrong with this line of thinking, but I think one of the worst parts of it is how utterly dehumanizing it really is, in that it ends up treating Japanese people as lesser. The reality is that their non-whiteness and the fetishization of Japan combine together to treat the country and its people as something to be consumed, something not entirely human. A very recent and clear example of this would be Ghost of Tsushima, a samurai game published by Sony and made by the Western developer Sucker Punch that treats Japan as an aesthetic rather than a real place with a real culture that extends far beyond cinematic samurai sword fights. Rather than engage with samurai history in a meaningful way, Ghost thoughtlessly cobbles together a series of boring tropes to make a game that inadvertently serves as alt-right Japanese propaganda by propagating the myth of the samurai as the true protectors of Japan, despite the real-life samurai being part of an upper class that mostly used their power to oppress the lower classes. Or the way it perpetuates the idea of a mythic samurai honor code, despite the Bushido Code Ghost all but explicitly bases its story on, being heavily editorialized and published in the 1900s by an English-speaking Japanese Christian who sought to make Japan appeal more to the West by comparing samurai to chivalric knights, who, mind you, were also horrible. If Sucker Punch actually viewed Japan as something other than an aesthetic, the entire game would be different. If the Western games media viewed Japan as something more than just an aesthetic, there would have been a lot more critical conversations around Ghost in all of its coverage, but the reality is that more often than not, Westerners don't see Japan for what it is, a real place with real politics and real people who live there, with a culture that has infinitely more to it than just anime and Akira Kurosawa films. If they did, then I wouldn't have felt the need to make this video, but as it is, I haven't seen anyone talk about Judgment and its themes. Just to be clear, my reading of Judgment isn't based on esoteric lines of dialogue and vague gesturing towards certain themes. I'm not talking about the subtext of its story. This is all literally just the text of it. The game is hardly subtle about any of this, and Ace Detective is the serial killer in the story. Even if the rest of the game wasn't about exploring the artificiality of the law and the morality behind those laws, Kuroiwa being a ruthless killer is inherently a political statement. Judgment is more than just another Yakuza game. It's more than just a fun romp through some lovingly created virtual tourism, and it's more than just an engrossing neo-noir detective story. It's a bold, multifaceted game with a nuanced look at the role police play in society and the systems they are a part of. I only hope I've done it justice.